conversation where we will talk about private sector opportunities. I think before we get into the nitty-gritty of this topic, I know that we're all committed to action, but having some numbers in mind helps frame the actions that we want to accomplish. The Paris agreements mention 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, preferably 1.5 degrees, because we know that in a world with 2 degrees, that would be loss of coral, loss of biodiversity, a rise in sea levels. That's 2 degrees. When we look at the world we're striving for right now with the policies that we have in place with today's commitments, the UN published a report, it's a yearly report before the COP. We are currently aiming toward a world of 2.4 degrees. If we add private sector goals, that's 1.8. We're not there yet. We need to act. We need to commit. We need to change. We need to make the most of these opportunities for technological change. We recently heard from the public sector. The public sector already has initiatives underway. They are updating their goals. Ministries of finance are part of the effort to create the conditions necessary to mobilize more private capital. So what do we have to do from a private capital standpoint? What do we have to do from the international context in order to mobilize climate action? That's a question that we asked ourselves at IDB Invest to think about. How do we increase ambition in our organization? How do we raise the sector's vision in Latin America and the Caribbean? And in that context, as we were thinking about these things, we felt that the best thing we could do was put together a blue ribbon panel to have a conversation with them, to have a sounding board, as we say, someone to challenge our ideas in order to think about the priority areas for the work that we do with the private sector. Since 2016, we have been increasing our private sector financing, but we want to break that glass ceiling, as they say in English, in order to grow and to raise ambition. So we called on this blue ribbon panel, some of them from private sector companies in the region, some international. We brought in academia, and we also brought in people that are part of the sphere of international negotiations, like Selwyn Hart, who's part of the United Nations. Unfortunately, I can't show you all of the faces of the members, but we're fortunate in that today we have 3 of the members in today's panel. This panel was led by Mauricio Cárdenas. Then we have Maria Fernanda Teixeira, Liz Bronder from Bank America. Maria Teixeira is part of several companies in Brazil. I'll give you some more details when we get the panelists up on stage. But I do want to tell you that the work that we've done with this Blue Ribbon panel, this report, we had support from the Eurasia Group. And their help was for us to talk about trends, to look at what we should aspire to in order to have more impact with the work that we do. With that, then I'm going to ask Maria Teixeira, Mauricio Cárdenas, Liz Bronder, Shari, and also one very important part of this conversation as members of the panel. It has to do with the work done through concessional funds. So we also have Patsy, who represents Finland, one of the donors to a concessional fund for IDB Invest. And we'll get into the details of that in our conversation. Thank you all very much for joining us and sharing the Blue Ribbon Panel's experience, as well as your experience in creating concessional funds for climate change, which is so important for the region. I would imagine everyone here is wondering, well, what are the trends? What are the opportunities that you've identified? The idea of this panel then is first we'll go to Shari, who is going to provide some background on these trends, and then we'll get into some specific questions for the panelists to hear their views from the work that they do, to see how we can take this toward a call for action so that the private sector in the region can support this ambition so that we can hit this goal, which is 1.5 degrees.
Thank you so much for coming and joining us. Could you tell us a little bit about what the trends are that you're seeing and the opportunities that we see?
Sure. Thank you. Thanks so much for having me, and also for working on this report. It's been really interesting. I'm Shari Friedman. I work at Eurasia Group. Eurasia Group is a geopolitical risk firm, and we look at trends around the world and how those affect businesses. And that's relevant in this discussion because we spend a lot of time, my group spends a lot of time, thinking about sustainability trends. And so I want to grab a few of those trends and talk about how they affect businesses in Latin America. So you can kind of look at this in two ways. There's the environmental trends broadly, and then there's the geopolitical trends that affect markets, that affect green markets. And so I'll touch on both of those briefly. So starting off with the environmental trends, I mean, the one that everybody always thinks about, of course, is climate change. And it is, and the way that this is manifesting that's relevant for companies is many ways, but a lot of countries are taking on net zero targets. And what that means is they're moving toward decarbonization. By November, about 140 countries had either taken or are about to take on net zero targets. And whether they get there or not, they're moving toward decarbonization. And what that's going to look like is going to vary by country in terms of pace and the priorities there. But I think the main point to track is that the decarbonization is happening and that companies need to be aware of their carbon footprint. The next few trends come in on the other sectors that are sort of following behind. And we're seeing this in biodiversity, in water, in plastics. And the things that all of these have in common is that they're moving from environmental risk being sort of incident related. So no more is it like about spills or about toxic releases. This is about fundamental changes in the environment and the corresponding policies that systematically affect businesses. So for example, with biodiversity, you have biodiversity loss that is affecting companies. So you're seeing that with agriculture, you're seeing it with clothing, you're seeing it in retail. And then you have the commensurate policies that are trying to reduce biodiversity loss, and then those affect companies because they affect companies like mining and they affect real estate. So you're starting to see this, whether you believe or not, or whether you're paying attention or not, they're going to affect the companies. And we're seeing this also in water. This year, for the first time, water was one of Eurasia Group's top risks that companies need to be thinking about. And it's not just that water is becoming more scarce, it's that policies and governments are going to be making decisions about who gets the water. So as we think about these, the next trend, I think, as you think about this being systematic, is that financiers are paying attention to this. They want to know that the companies that they're investing in are positioning themselves to thrive in an environment where you maybe not have the resources that you had before or where policies are changing. And so this is where disclosures come in. There's a lot of investors are looking at disclosures. They're wanting to see how companies are positioning themselves. And this is becoming mandatory in some countries, including some countries in Latin America. But whether you're in a country where it is mandatory or not, it's still relevant to the companies in their ability to attract global capital. Another way that I think that this is important is in trade. And environmental factors are increasingly moving into the trade conversation in a much more substantive way. And the way that the piece everybody knows right away is the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, where the European Union has put a carbon price on some sectors, and then some subsector of that, they're going to put a price at the border for imports coming in from countries that don't have a commensurate price, on a carbon price for those materials. So that's clearly going to have an impact on a lot of on many of the companies. So then you also have global trends, just broad geopolitical trends that are affecting the green markets. And so that I can't, of course, have time to go into all of them. That would be a very long talk. But just taking the US and China decoupling, this is going to mean the US and also Europe, their very aggressive green agendas rely a lot on materials and on finished products coming in from China. And as they decouple, that's going to create opportunities for other markets to be providing those. Both countries are trying to build their own capacity, but if China takes a more aggressive stance inside of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, you're going to see this decoupling happening at a more rapid pace, which means that there's going to be a lot of movement on trying to find kind of friend shoring. So all of this creates opportunities in a lot of different sectors. It creates opportunities in energy, in renewable energy, in green buildings, in sustainable agriculture, in processed mining, in manufacturing of a lot of the goods that countries need to develop, like iron and steel and glass, and how can those be manufactured more sustainably. So those are some of the trends that we're seeing, and of course they have to be balanced with developmental goals as you're starting to think about this through the IDB, and that's what this conversation will be about. And so with that, I'd like to pass it back over to Helene.
Thank you so much, Harry. Maria Fernanda, I'll ask you the next question, but before, let me tell you, Maria Fernanda is a board member of companies including Raya, Drogasil, Grupo Simpar, Grupo Vamos, Clarinet Technology. She's a chair of the board of the directors of Perola. She has been an executive for over 30 years in multinational companies, reaching the C-level at some of the largest technology and payment companies in the world. She was recognized by Forbes as amongst the most influential executive women in technology and business. So thank you so much, first of all, Maria Fernanda, for joining the Blue Ribbon panel, for joining the process, the conversations. And since you're involved in so many board meetings, I wanted to ask you about the trend that Shari just mentioned regarding net zero strategies. Is that part of the board conversations that you've seen? What are the takeaways of those conversations at the boards?
Well, first, thank you, Helene, and thank you, IDB, for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here. And let me tell you that the answer is yes, yes, and yes. Lots of companies. It's amazing. But in the last 3 years, the companies are really, really working hard now, understanding the challenge that our planet has, and working hard on that. So it's really amazing, the changes that I have seen in the boards, as well at the top executives. I'm going to mention some examples to you. Last week, we had the United Nations. They held the ambitious 2030 forum in São Paulo. Basically Brazil, but it was in São Paulo. We never saw how many CEOs and board members together. We had more than 1,000 CEOs and board members in this one-day forum committed. We have already in Brazil more than 2,000 companies that are signed the Ambition 2030 Pact. So this is really, amazing. In less than, 2-3 years. In all boards that I'm part of, the ones that you mentioned, yes, they do have, ESG, not just climate change, in their agendas, and they are really committed, all the boards. And another thing that helps, and this is a tip here to all of you, when the audit committee comes and say, we have to include climate change in our risks and measure materiality, then everything changes. So that's another thing that, and I'm the one doing that. I'm the one bringing it to the board. And it works, because then, the board members get a little bit scared because other board members are bringing that, and they start. For sure, it's something new. It's really hard for the companies to really measure the materiality of climate change, but it's happening. Let me give you another wonderful example. For some companies, it's really hard for them to say, how do I start, right? So my recommendation is always try to identify a certification, right? Because if you align a certification and you really committed the whole company with the ESG initiatives, and it works. So normally I recommend corporate B certification. And just to give you an idea, one of the companies of Grupo Simpar is called Movida, is a rental car company. They were the first company in the world to receive B Corporate in the rental car business. So it really works. If you define, some certification, the whole company gets committed. There's another company that it's new. I'm just new there, and they produce batteries. And you can imagine the challenge, right, in companies producing batteries. But they have investing a lot of money in the lithium batteries as well. They are creating a new business that became an opportunity with clean energy. So, but I need to tell you one thing. In the technology company that I'm part of the board, they work with cybersecurity, clouds, and it's pure technology. And when I started there, I said, I'm going to be there only if we create an ESG committee, and if we start really working on that. And you know what the CEO did? He said, wow, we have a big opportunity here, right? So he personally, because he's one of the shareholders of the company, he started buying farms and land 2 years ago. So now he has a commitment that by 2025, means only 3 years, he will be with 10 million plants or trees planted. It's just to give you an example of how opportunities come. Because he says, well, I'm going to be positive, net positive. And by the way, I'm going to sell credits. So in the private market, it's amazing what's happening. And I'm so happy and so excited that things are moving.
No, thank you so much, Maria Fernanda. I think that you show that the leadership of all these companies have to be engaged, and I think we see that. We see more and more CEOs and board members being engaged and committed to this agenda. The same happens in the public sector, right? We just heard it from the panel before, that if you have a president that is so involved in the policy making, then you have real change in also the public policies of the country. Liz, I'm going to move to you, but again, before I ask the question to Liz, let me tell you that Liz Bronder is the Managing Director of Global Sustainable Finance in Bank of America. She's an expert in sustainable finance and impact investment with a focus on development finance, working with development finance institutions in emerging markets. She advises issuers and financiers institutions on sustainable development goals and social bonds, as well as impact measurements and management. She has delivered structured investment and innovative advisory solutions to firms and governments, and she advises venture capital and global development boards. And again, Liz, thank you so much for having been part of this panel. I think a lot of the conversations we had on how to increase capital mobilization were very much guided by what you were seeing. So why don't you, share with us, how do you see the capital mobilization from private sector, the opportunities in the region in comparison to other regions of the world, because you work in different emerging markets, and so the Latin American region may have some peculiarities?
So thank you very much, Hélène and IDB Invest, for this invitation to join you all for this important conversation. So first, to say that the call to action to private financial institutions really began in Addis Ababa when it was determined that we would never reach our goals for sustainable development without the private sector. And the private sector financial institutions have really embraced this, and especially for climate, set their own goals. So I think that that's the first thing, as you were saying, that to actually have your own goals for net zero, that means not only what you do for yourself in scope 1 and in scope 2, how you use energy in your own operations. Those are easy, let's say, for a bank to achieve. But scope 3, where you're really trying to help your clients achieve their net zero goals, is really what is going to take us into a decarbonized world. So we have been very active helping our clients, but we've also introduced new products. I think the green bonds, sustainability bonds, which we've heard a number of governments and issuers in Latin America have used, have been very important. And we've also introduced, which is maybe not a new product overall, but for our institution, project finance, which helps us to deploy our own balance sheet. And we've actually found this to be easier for us in Latin America than in some other regions, because there are companies and governments here that are setting their targets that are looking for these opportunities. There are institutional investors that are looking for these opportunities. And so we've been able to work in a number of different countries to bring about these climate-oriented financial solutions. And what we've learned from deploying our own balance sheet is that when we're working in some of the larger countries in Latin America that have deeper capital markets, we can do this on our own. We can bring investors to these markets. But some of the countries are smaller, and this really requires this partnership that we seek with multilateral development banks. And we have in just the last few months been able to partner with IDB Invest on a B loan that we did for renewable energy in the Dominican Republic, and also for a very large B bond, which was issued by a telecommunications company in Costa Rica. So these are the types of markets that benefit from financial institutions being able to bring private capital, but also from the partnerships with the development banks that have deep relationships with governments and important standards that they set in this area.
Thank you, Liz. And I think both examples are very innovative. The one in Costa Rica, not only the structuring, but working with the telecom company that was doing the first SLB as well, of defining the KPIs. As we were hearing in the previous panel, the KPIs is important to actually get the impact later on and to monitor that impact is very, very important. So Mauricio, I'll pass it on to you. But again, before I ask the question, let me just read a little bit of his resume, not all of it, but he's a professor of professional practice at CIPA right now and a former finance minister of Colombia. And he's also the director of the MPA in Global Leadership at Columbia University School of International Political Affairs, and a Global Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Global Energy Policy, where he conducts research on energy and climate policy. He served as the Colombian Minister of Energy in 2011 to 2012, and then as the Colombian Finance Minister from 2012 to 2018. So Mauricio, you know that part of the conversations of the capital adequacy framework, the CAF review, and also for the first time, the COP in 27, they call for MDBs to work and to do more on climate, right? And you had the opportunity to be the chair of the panel. You talked with all the members of the panel, and then you presented the report to our CEO, James Scriven, and also to the president, Ilan Golfan. And you talked a lot about climate, changing the climate mindset. What does that mean in terms, we talked just now on leadership, but what does that mean and how do you see that applying to the region?
Well, thank you very much, Helen. It's actually a great privilege and a great honor to be here. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for being here. I'm delighted I'm sharing the panel with two members of our Blue Ribbon panel, Maria Fernanda and Liz, and Shari, who was so instrumental in putting together the views in a magnificent document that I really commend you to read, because it's really one piece that gives good perspective about what the challenges are ahead. You mentioned I was finance minister. Yes, I was finance minister. 8 years ago, the annual meetings of the IDB took place in Busan, in Korea. And those were memorable annual meetings because it's the year in which the shareholders of the IDB came together to the idea of creating the IDB Invest. And IDB Invest has already been doing great things during the last 8 years. Last year, 30% of the transactions that IDB Invest were in climate finance. So that's about $2 billion, which is fantastic. But we need to take the IDB Invest to the next level. And this is the reason why this panel was convened. And essentially understand what the trends are in the world and in the region, and transform that into action for the IDB Invest. So the main conclusion is that demands are really high, demands on climate finance. And they come from responsible corporations like the ones that Maria Fernanda just described in Brazil. They come from banks, commercial banks, investment banks, like Liz was mentioning, that want partnerships, that want to work together. But they also come from the world in which we live that faces many threats. And among those threats, climate is one of them, food is another one, energy, and certainly protectionism. Shari mentioned the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which eventually could impose tariffs on products that come from countries that do not enforce carbon prices or do not have serious climate policies. So the region has a lot of demands. And the IDB Invest should become, and that's the goal, the leading green bank for the private sector in the region. And this involves a new mindset. This involves not just changing in terms of the focus and in terms of the operations, it's also mentality in terms of the way projects are assessed. It's also a new mindset in the way the IDB Invest interacts with clients, because many clients will need advice, will need help internalizing these trends, transforming these trends into concrete projects. But it also means that IDB Invest has to step up the game and requires more funding, requires more capital. The IDB Invest has done a lot with the capital it was provided at the beginning. It was, I have to say, small. But now, really, to accommodate all these demands, the institution needs more capital. And I think that's the pledge, that's the main ask we're making to the shareholders in this report. And let me tell you why. Because the IDB Invest plays a very important role that no one else is going to play. In some countries, it can complement the local financial sectors, help de-risk some of the projects. But in other countries, it could mean also the origination of new projects, the seed capital to be able to develop the projects, and concessional funding, because otherwise it's going to be difficult to get the ball going. And here I'm thinking in terms of countries in the Caribbean, countries in Central America, so we need that type of support. So the job is huge. The first 8 years have been remarkable. The next 8 years could be even more transformational for the region. I am a true believer that as the world has so many challenges, so many threats, so many multiple crises, Latin America can be part of the solution this time around. Less than be part of the problem, could be part of the solution. We have the biodiversity to help the world deal with climate change. We have the water, we have the land, to be able to produce food with a low carbon footprint. We have the energy that the world needs as well. And we have also a great location in a peaceful hemisphere. We're a region that is not going to threaten anyone, that is not going to cause wars, that is not going to cause conflict. So we are the poster child for friendshoring. But all that requires capital and requires financing. And that's the reason we wrote this report.
Thank you, Mauricio. And Patsy, I will ask you the next question, but again, I will introduce you, Patsy Hellman, who is serving as the Undersecretary of State for Development Policy at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Finland. At the Foreign Ministry, he has previously worked, among other things, as Deputy Director General and Director of the Unit of the Department for Development of Policy. Hellman was the Managing Director of the NDF, Nordic Development Fund, in 2012 to 2018, and served as the Board of Directors, member of the on the Board of Directors of the ADB, Asian Development Bank in Manila from 2004 to 2007. He has served in the embassies of Finland in The Hague, Nairobi, Board of Directors of the Asian Development Bank in Manila. Patsy, as you just heard, Mauricio mentioned concessional funding. The report highlights the need for advisory services, concessional funds, and also the work with the public sector in this collaboration of partnerships of doing the right policies for then enabling private sector to invest. We recently signed a concessional fund with Finland for blended finance resources for IDB Invest. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about the fund?
Well, thank you, Elen, and thank you very much for the kind invitation to this very important panel. And I'm particularly pleased that as a representative of the public sector, I've been invited to a panel on private sector together with other panelists from the private sector. I think that really shows and hopefully sends the signal that how important the interplay and collaboration between the public and the private sectors are. I, of course, very much welcome the work that IDB and IDB Invest have done to expand their climate finance business and to also to diversify the climate portfolio. And the fund that you mentioned, which was established in December by Finland and IDB Invest, focusing on supporting green transition and improving resilience and adaptation capacity in this region, and where Finland put in 50 million euros to support this work. I think that's a demonstration of our thinking that you really do need concessional funding to support this kind of transformation, green transition in many countries in the region, and also then of course to catalyze, to unlock more private investments for these purposes. I was I actually worked with the IDB earlier in a previous capacity when IDB was developing something called NDC Accelerator, to support countries to reach their nationally determined contributions and to help and improve in project preparation and really to accelerate the progress towards reaching the NDCs. And there also the case for concessional funding, advisory services, project preparations were really important. Of course, for us, for Finland, because we have committed to make our own transition to carbon neutrality in a fair way and in a way that ensures that no one is left behind. So that's the reason why this fund with IDB Invest will also focus its climate investments on the poorest and the most vulnerable countries and communities, and also pay close attention to gender equality, diversity, inclusion, and things like that.
Thank you, Patsy. Maria Fernanda, one of the questions that came in the panels before during the day today was the issue of the S within the ESG, right? The social. We shouldn't just talk about transition, but we should talk about just transition. We had just before a gender equity panel. What can you tell us about the S, so important for the region, and how it links to the concept of climate change?
Yeah, this is extremely important, especially if we talk about Latin America and Caribbean. We see a lot of poverty, a lot of hunger, a lot of people living on the streets right now due to the economy crisis, or favelas increasing more and more. So my point is, we in the private sector, we have no way to have perennity if we don't look to the S, right? Because S is not just diversity, right? Diversity is important, as we heard in the last panel, or one panel before, but it's not only that. What are we doing to, reduce the gap that we have in our region from the rich people, median, and poor people? It just increases the number of poor people. So the companies have a responsibility. So that's why the S is so important now. How are we going to connect the E, that we talked a lot about it, and now the S, how can we improve the conditions of people? And G is key, in my opinion, because if the private sector that makes decisions much faster, the private sector do not need to wait for legislation to make change, right? And private sector is much faster. So we can make a lot of difference with the G, because if we have a good governance and we include in the G a lot of targets that includes the E, and most of companies are focusing on that, but they are not really focused on the S. So for me, right now, I am the one provoking the private sector, saying, guys, there is no way to keep our globe with this number of people with hunger, living over the streets or living badly houses. So for me, it's the three letters, but I would change the order, right? I would include G first, then the other two, because they are equally important, but the G is key for me.
No, thank you so much, Maria Fernanda. I think that part of the issue is that we have to understand the context where we're operating, and definitely the social agenda in the region is very important.
Yeah.
And I think that the driver or the enabler could be, as you just mentioned, the G. Another important point of the context where we operate is the biodiversity, and the fund that we just signed with Finland had a very important component or mention of biodiversity. Patsy, can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, thanks. I think it's actually quite simple. Climate change and biodiversity loss are really inseparable and sort of interdependent threats in our world to the humankind. So they must be addressed in an integrated manner. I think the COP15 biodiversity COP that was held in Montreal in December after quite a lot of delays, because it was supposed to be held in Kunming, China, much earlier. But I think that meeting helped, I think, all of us to understand really the importance of biodiversity, and really brought that issue on a higher level in the international agenda, and really makes us understand that well-functioning, resilient ecosystems are actually helping us to adapt and mitigate climate change. Now, this region, of course, Latin America and the Caribbean, is very rich in biodiversity, and I think if we can find ways to support opportunities in this area, I think the private sector also can play a very important role in sort of avoiding biodiversity loss and increasing conservation. And maybe lastly on this, the earlier panel, there was a reference made to the International Global Coalition of Finance Ministers on climate change, which is actually an initiative which was co-initiated by Finland and co-chaired also by the Finnish finance minister. But that coalition has agreed certain principles for climate finance that the finance minister should take into account, and that group has also made a recommendation to establish similar principles for biodiversity financing. So I think that's something that should be looked more closely into in the near future.
Thank you, Patsy. And I think that another question is, how do we innovate to include biodiversity and nature with the climate agenda? And maybe, Liz, can we brainstorm on what you have seen on possibilities of doing more of these financial examples that you mentioned before, but moving beyond renewable energies and to the biodiversity space, and even more to the adaptation space? Because as we know, our region is one of the regions that is most affected by climate change. And I remember in the conversations of the Blue Ribbon panel that you mentioned that we need metrics, but those metrics should be also from the market, right? We shouldn't invent something that it's not then taken on by the market. So what are your take? What are the opportunities there?
Thank you. So I think, first of all, there's some important lessons that we can learn from how things have worked well in the past. I mean, what we see is that setting targets is actually very important. So when companies are setting net zero targets, when countries are setting decarbonization targets, that really galvanizes innovation and thinking about how are you going to meet that. And the opportunities then become huge because there's this need to be creative, to have new ways of solving these climate issues, and the technology development has been enormous. We're looking at green hydrogen, carbon capture, carbon sequestration, and these are all needing to be developed, invested in, and then adopted by countries and also by companies. And the green economy is also just developing. So electric vehicle manufacturing, solar panels, all kinds of different services are new and ready for new entrepreneurship, new investment, and have a lot of potential. But in addition to all of the technology solutions, the nature-based solutions are really fundamental, because you cannot solve biodiversity with technology innovations, at least not that we know now. So Latin America has an incredible opportunity to really invest in and make everyone aware of what can really be done when you're preserving nature, conserving nature, and adapting to the changes that climate change is making. So I think the opportunities are both in the sort of industrial technology sectors as well as in the nature-based solutions, which we try to support by focusing things on, let's say, blue bonds or different types of ways and approaches and programs that can really drive financing towards these kinds of nature-based conservation programs.
Thank you, Liz. Mauricio, hearing all these trends towards the future, the areas of opportunities is there in terms of sectors, but also of instruments. What are your views how are these trends going to move forward in the region?
Well, and listening to these last parts of the conversation, I think it's a very important element, because I guess the main point here is we're very worried about greenhouse gas emissions. We're very worried about climate change. And it's good that we're now much more aware of about that, but it's not enough. We need to make sure that we cover a much wider spectrum, because it's not just about greenhouse gases, it's also about the loss of biodiversity. In fact, some of the interdependencies that are related to climate change, for example, in the case of health, are related to that aspect, to loss of species and changes in the seas, coral reefs, etc. So we have to think in a wider framework, and that's the importance of the COP15 on biodiversity. It elevated the discussion, and it created the type of awareness. What this means is that when we come to the projects and we come to financing, it's not just about the reduction in emissions. We have to worry about issues, for example, related to waste, the circular economy. We have to worry about the way we manage water, the treatment of water. So the list of projects is much bigger. The use of plastics, for example. So all these point in the direction that since we're in the early stages of these new kind of like era for the IDB Invest, it's good to put this in the blueprint of what the action will be, which is let's finance projects, for example, that reduce waste or that encourage the circular economy in different corporations, in different industries. And those are as important as the ones that reduce emissions. So it's that wider framework. And let me say that this involves also an introspective view of the production processes. So firms becoming a lot more aware of what they're doing and trying to change things. It's not just about government policies. It's not just about regulation. It's also about consciousness. It's also about thinking in terms of what the consumers want. And the consumers are asking for this. So this is an important driver. It's not just that we're going to follow what the norm and the regulations and the laws are saying. It's a lot of this is market driven. And I would say that one particular aspect of this that is very relevant for Latin America is food production. So very important in the production of soy, of cattle. Latin America is very rich in that. But we have to ensure that we continue doing that in the context of respecting and defending our biodiversity. And this is the idea of restorative agriculture, producing biofuels of second, third generation. This is very important, and I think this is the area in which we have a lot of work to do, many projects to finance, many ideas to develop.
Thank you, Mauricio, and thank you all for coming to be part of the Blue Ribbon panel, the process, Patsy, for joining the private sector panel. So let me just conclude with these few words. We know we have to act now. We have to do transition plans for the private sector companies, but we know it's not easy. It is a hard process, but we're here to help you. We're going to be able to support you in that process. We want you to know that either the private sector companies or the governments know that IDB Group is there to support that transition, not only a regular transition, but a just transition mainly. And also with a focus on biodiversity and adaptation. We know that otherwise the vulnerable peoples will be most affected by the impacts of climate change. So we want to act now. We need to start now, because otherwise we're running out of time. We have to invest in the future we want, and we have to start now. So with that, thank you so much for coming here, for joining us outside somewhere in the world, and for being with us in IDB Invest. Thank you.